As we continue to talk about probabilities, I want to look again at when we roll a fair six-sided die. And so as we look at this die, remember that our sample space is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we have 6 different outcomes. So our sample space, our sample size, n, is going to be 6 because I have 6 different possible outcomes. So that's going to be my 6. Now, whenever I look at the probability of any of these events happening, so probability of any event happening for this six-sided die or anything, we're going to look at what is considered our frequency divided by our n. So however many times event A occurs divided by our sample size. Now this formula should look familiar. It's basically our relative frequency. When we look at probabilities, we are either going to simplify fractions, so we need to have them in simplified fraction format, or we're going to round. If it doesn't tell us, we're going to go to 3 decimals. Now, I know some programs will tell us 4 decimals, so just make sure you pay attention to instructions on that. Okay? So, looking at our six-sided die, let's just look at a couple of probabilities, and in here is where you're going to put what you're wanting the probability of. So, for example, I want the probability of rolling a 4. Well, I know that my denominator is going to be 6 to start out with. And I look up here and I say, okay, 4 occurs 1 time. So I'm just going to put a 1. So my probability of rolling a 4 is just 1/6. Now, if I say the probability of rolling a number greater than 2. Well, I know again my denominator is going to be 6, and I look up here and I want to pay attention to any number greater than 2. Well, that would be all of these numbers. So there are 4 of them, and so I would do 4/6, which would simplify into 2/3. So if you have anything that you are, it's not just one of them, it could be 4, it could be 7, anything like that, okay? Now, if I say the probability of rolling a 9, don't change it, okay? I actually want the probability of rolling a 9. Well, in this case, what's the probability of rolling a 9? If I look up here, do I have a 9 in this sample space? No, I don't. So if I do not have any, how many times does 9 occur? 0. And I have 6 in my sample space. Well, 0 divided by any number is 0. Which brings me to some of the properties of probabilities. So when we look at properties of probabilities, and let me spell that correctly. So when we look at the properties of probabilities, a couple of things have to take place, or we have to remember, is that probabilities are going to have to be between 0 and 1. You can never have a number that's negative, So you have no negatives. And nothing greater than 1. Think about probabilities as percentages also. You can't have greater than 100% of the time. You can't have the chance greater than 100%. In other words, if you are a quarterback and you are throwing the ball, you cannot throw the ball 100% of the time to your, more than 100% of the time to your receivers. You can't have more than 100% accuracy. Now, you also cannot have a negative. You can have a 0, like we just saw, but you can't have a negative. So you have to remember that probabilities have to be between 0 and 1. They can be 0 and they can be 1. An event that is 0 cannot happen. That's like our rolling a 9 when you only have a 6-sided die. Now, something that it has a probability of 1 is certain to happen. Now, let's think about our 6-sided die, and let's say I want the probability of rolling a number that is less than 9. Well, if I think about my die, every single one of those numbers is less than 9. So 6 of those numbers is less than 9 out of the 6. So that's going to be a 1. Now don't worry about 7 and 8 because they're not part of our sample space anyway. Yes, they're less than 9, but they're not part of our sample space. It is certain that any number that I roll is going to be less than 9. So we have to make sure that we look at some of these properties of probabilities. Now, the other property of probabilities that we want to look at is what we consider unusual events. Now, these are kind of like our outliers, things that are not common. There's not a hard and fast rule about this, but we're going to use anything that has a probability that is less than a 0.05. So anything that has a probability less than 0.05, less than 5%, is going to be unusual. That means it's something that we kind of need to look at. That means it may be an outlier. Again, this is not a hard and fast rule. We're just going to establish this rule for our class. It depends on what industry you're in as to what they consider an unusual event. So practice some basic probabilities and let me know if you have any questions.